Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on how pandemic response can inform the path forward. I'm Chris Field, Director of Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Today's webinar is organized by the Woods Institute and the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. The Woods Institute for the Environment is Stanford's marquee investment in advancing understanding and developing practical solutions to our era's pressing environmental problems. It allows faculty and students from across the university to combine expertise, broaden perspectives, and craft solutions that work for the economy and the environment. The Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford is a leading incubator of human-centered knowledge. The center brings together deep thinkers from diverse disciplines and communities to advance understanding of the full range of human beliefs, behaviors, interactions, and institutions. COVID-19, monumental public health crisis, with a grim toll and lives lost and economies disrupted. Now, more than 6 months into the pandemic and with more than 23 million confirmed cases, it feels like last year was a different world, with contrasting patterns of social interaction, economic activity, entertainment, and education. A global awakening to the pervasiveness of racial injustice makes 2020 even more unique and potentially consequential. In today's conversation, we want to explore the implications of this most unusual year, looking beyond the disruption to open a window on lessons learned or lessons that might be learned. Responses to the pandemic have produced a wide range of indirect effects that have altered ecosystems in the atmosphere. Businesses are seeing massive changes in demand, marked by the dramatic news that futures contracts for US crude oil had negative prices in April. The surge in unemployment and underemployment is pushing many into poverty, while aid packages have protected others, especially in rich countries. All these impacts have direct and indirect ripple effects that are providing new insights into the way things work. Evidence about unexpected causal links is opening doors to challenging social norms and potentially allowing governments and businesses to reimagine how they operate. In today's webinar, I'm excited to talk with 3 Stanford experts about how we should look for lessons and what they might be. Are there lessons from the pandemic that can contribute to a better future? What opportunities have revealed themselves or might still be revealed? And what will it take for change to last? The 3 panelists for today's conversation are Inês Acevedo, Rob Jackson, and Margaret Levy. Inês Acevedo is Associate Professor of Energy Resources at Engineering at Stanford and a Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment. Inês is a very unusual kind of engineer. She focuses on issues where traditional engineering approaches play an important role, but cannot provide a complete answer, where one also needs to integrate environmental, economic, and policy perspectives. Much of her work focuses on assessing how energy systems are likely to evolve in the future. Rob Jackson is the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Provostial Professor in the Stanford Department of Earth System Science and a Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment and the Precourt Institute for Energy. Though trained as an ecologist, Rob's lab now works on issues that range from understanding soil microbes to quantifying natural gas leakage from home appliances. He's a leading authority on greenhouse gas emissions budgets and a skilled science communicator, augmenting technical papers with poetry, children's books, and photographs. Margaret Levy is Professor of Political Science at Stanford, the Sarah Miller McCune Director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and a Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment. Margaret's widely recognized work on improving the quality of government, sustainable supply chains, and many other areas has earned numerous awards, including election to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. At the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences, Margaret facilitates collaborations across academia, policy, industry, civil society, and government to collectively design a better future. Let me switch now to questions, and I want to start with Rob. Can you provide a few examples of the way that COVID-related changes in human activity have altered the natural world? And in particular, are there important changes that most people haven't noticed?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And first of all, thank you all for joining. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really look forward to the questions and discussion. The most obvious changes are things like air pollution and declines in greenhouse gas emissions. We can unpack those later in the webinar if people want to, but there are lots of other surprising changes that the confinement brought. Ecologists measure soundscapes, background noise what you can hear, what parts of the natural world can you hear? And they documented, really amazing increases in our ability to hear water flowing, breezes, things that things that make us feel good because the world is a quieter place with fewer airline miles, flights, less traffic, and less industrial activity. And it isn't just audio sounds. Seismologists, including people here in the geophysics department at Stanford, documented the quietest period of seismic vibrations and such that we had seen. Much quieter than say between Christmas and New Year's. So that's less heavy equipment moving, just all sorts of things that we don't expect. And then everyone's heard about animals, dolphins moving back into the Venice canals because the water is clean, lions sitting in the middle of roads in Kruger National Park. So I think the world has quieted, has stilled, and the animals have sort of retaken some of the space that was there. And then perhaps one last thing is not everything was in that direction, with fewer people in the field, more concerns about infections. There were less inspectors around. Brazil had a 1/3 increase in deforestation the first 5 months of this year. So the fact that people aren't out and about has some good effects and some negative effects too. So those are just a few examples beyond the expectations of cleaner air and less greenhouse gas emissions that I'm happy to talk about later.
Great. Well, I think that's opened a door to the kind of changes where there might be persistent lessons. And let me turn now to Margaret and just ask about how societies learn from experiences like this. The real purpose of today's discussion is to explore the possibility that there are valuable lessons to be learned from the way that ecosystems and economies and societies respond to or haven't responded to pandemic-induced changes. But the potential for learning requires a lot. It requires reasonably clear links between cause and effect. It requires focus so that we can internalize the learning. In the world of 2020, which is certainly cacophonous if nothing else, what do individuals and organizations need to do to increase their openness to opportunities for learning from the pandemic?
Yeah, well, Chris, we're seeing lots of immediate reactions and seeming learning about things like safety and social insurance and security, and even some changes to protect the environment. But for those lessons to be absorbed, they need one at the individual level. They often require something that's very hard to achieve and sustain, which is a real change in beliefs about how the world works and how the world should work. But it also requires a neutralization of opposition to various kinds of changes. So in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of floods, in the midst of fires, in our sort of biblical moment, we see openness to change and a sort of reduction in the opposition of some of the interested parties, but will that be sustained? And finally, we have to institutionalize the lessons. So let me be more concrete about that. At CASBIS, at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, we've now had for several years a project with which several of you have been involved on generating a new moral, political, economic framework, which really tries to, and this moment has allowed us to actually make some progress because people are much more open and learning that the market can't solve all issues, that there are a variety of ways in which government roles have to change and government agencies have to be reformed. The election here and in other countries will matter a lot in helping move towards institutionalization. But let me give an even more specific case. I'm based in Seattle, and the streets not far from me have been full of racial justice demonstrations and some violence, and that was somewhat connected to that. And clearly a strong effort at police reform. You may not know this, but my dissertation was on police unions. So I've actually, many, many years ago, so I've actually given a lot of thought to policing. And there have been lots of efforts at reform of police in the past with both positive consequences, negative consequences, and unintended consequences. So what have we learned from those lessons, and how can we institutionalize this moment that we're in to really improve a broken agency, the police, which has lots of good things in it, but also lots of problematic aspects. And what we've learned is that we need to do some things about neutralizing some of the opposition to change. So the unions of police clearly are terrific in representing workers' voice and in securing their health and safety, but they also have to have their bargaining scope reduced so that they're not contributing to the militarization of the police, to protecting officers who have violated the standards and the rules. So that's a kind of institutionalized change, which also requires a neutralization of the opposition. So we need to change who has power vis-a-vis the police, make them more accountable to the community. And we also have to institutionalize a number of things that we've learned in the last moments in this period and in other periods about how we have to demilitarize the police to a much greater extent, how we have to introduce implicit bias training, and how we have to have better mechanisms for getting rid of those elements of the police who are problematic, which is a minority, but still has a significant impact on the society. And that requires a culture shift as well. So that's my response. These are not easy problems to solve in the long term.
Yeah, thank you. Let me follow up on your point about that the lessons from the pandemic are different depending on where you sit in society. And let me turn to Inej and ask about some of this, some of the environmental justice implications. You know, we've all read a lot about the way that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the poor and communities of color. There have been lots of reporting on the concentration of job losses in sectors where wages are lower. Are we also seeing environmental justice implications of the way that COVID-19 has altered access to energy or exposure to energy-related pollution? And are there lessons from this, from the disproportionate impacts?
Thank you so much, Chris, and it's lovely to participate in this panel. Indeed, that there is some indication that there are multiple aspects associated with environmental justice that will also play a role during this pandemic. Some of our own work has been to deploy a survey to 1,200 participants across the US in something close to a representative sample. And we asked several questions related to consumption patterns for electricity, natural gas, transportation patterns, even use of online and internet connected devices to understand how people's consumption, or at least perceived consumption, changed before and after the pandemic. Or better said, during the pandemic. And a few of the things that we found was that several segments of the population are affected disproportionately. So, for example, Black and Asian people report a likely increase in their electricity consumption of more than 50% predominantly, versus other groups that also generally report an increase, but a mild one. Now, those are perceived increases in electricity consumption and electricity bills. And some of our prior work actually has compared perceived electricity consumption with actual electricity consumption by households at the household level, really monitoring the actual appliance electricity use and comparing that to what people thought they were consuming. And there are vast misconceptions just there. So people generally would state that small consuming appliance would consume much more, and appliances that would actually dominate would consume less. So we need to take all those results with a grain of salt. We also find that people state that their behaviors will continue in their alternate patterns of consumption after the pandemic is finally resolved, which again may be something that would hold or not hold in reality. There are other dimensions of environmental justice of concern. So one positive thing was that during the severe lockdown, of course, the emissions from criteria pollutants from power plants and industries decreased substantially. And so there is a benefit in terms of reduced premature mortality associated with that decrease. That pales in comparison with the damages that we're seeing in terms of lives lost and loss of jobs and economic recession that may be upcoming. But there was a benefit there, and that benefit will likely be the largest for people of color and low-income households, which were predominantly affected from the pollution associated with coal-fired plants in this country. I'll end there for now.
Yeah, let me stick with this theme of changes in emissions associated with energy, Rob. I know that that's a topic that you've worked really a lot on, and I don't think it's a big surprise that if you use less energy, there are fewer energy-related emissions. But are there any indications in the data that you've seen that indicate mechanisms by which we can be more effective at separating economic activity from the associated emissions?
Yeah, let me think about that a second. And I think the answer is yes. So maybe as a brief background, we through colleagues in the Global Carbon Project that I chair, documented a decline in global emissions of about 1/6. And that was sort of peak daily emissions. That would have been in April. And here in the US, for a few weeks, first half of April, the emissions were down an astounding almost 1/3. Of course, the reason for that decline isn't sustainable, and it's not what we want, right? We know that we can make emissions decline and make pollution decline if the world's economy crashes. And that isn't a solution, a viable or sustainable solution to the problems that we have. As Inez referred to, sulfur and nitrous oxide pollution were down 1/3 to 1/2 in a lot of big cities around the world. So I think there are ways that we hope to decouple those things. And an example would be, instead of forcing people to stay at home to reduce pollution, we could have the same benefit in air quality in cities like Los Angeles, here in the Bay Area, and around the world by coupling clean energy to electric cars, for example. And we would not have to stay at home to do that. So people's lives could return mostly to normal. And there's a lot to unpack in that issue with transportation and rethinking cities and streets and pedestrians and mass transit and bikes and such. But nonetheless, we could have that beautiful clean air just simply by transforming our vehicle fleet. So I think there are ways to decouple the pollution from economic activity by rethinking the way that we generate that activity.
Rob,
I want to back up just quickly, if I may. I had a chat comment about Brazil. If I said that deforestation went down in Brazil, I misspoke. Deforestation for the first half or so of this year has been up 1/3, really just a dramatic increase.
Rob, one of the things that I was thinking about in regards to how something we might have learned during this period is that there's a huge demand for green space, particularly in the urban areas where people have been allowed to walk, but are basically shut in. And as we know, green space can contribute to improving the air as well as improving the quality of people's health. So that's another thing that could change. I mean, as cities start to revive and rebuild, rethinking what some of our structures look like and rethinking about how to provide access to more parklands of various kinds might be a very positive a consequence of this pandemic.
I agree completely. And just as a, as a quick follow-up, we're seeing cities rethinking roads. The roads that were closed to give people more space to walk and bike are staying closed in cities like Seattle and Oakland and in Europe and elsewhere. So it's really providing city managers an opportunity to rethink mobility and transportation. And for me, that's one of the biggest potential long-term changes of COVID is rethinking the way we get around. So I agree with you, Margaret, 100%.
One of the interesting challenges that's illustrated by this green space example is how the responses, they're not directly related necessarily to what the impacts are, and that there's a required element of creativity at the kind of institutional level as well as at the personal level. Margaret or Inez, you want to comment on what it takes to be prepared to be creative at the institutional level? Or are there things that we need to be thinking about as a culture and a society to be more ready to adopt changes and to implement changes?
Well, I think one of the pieces of it is that people are more open to thinking about things differently. That, this has been an awful period of time and there is no way around that. But it has gotten people to think differently about how they want to operate in the world, including how they want to walk, how they want to work, how they want to interact with other people in ways that we can take advantage of. That is a source of creativity. So people, the people in the cities are rethinking themselves and creating these spaces and making demands for the roads to stay closed, for new green spaces to be provided, et cetera. But we also need leadership that thinks creatively and is responsive to those demands with innovative ideas. And that leadership isn't just those we elect, it's also those of us sitting in this seminar and listening to this seminar who are part of the creative energy that should be generating new ideas and new solutions.
We'll take a solution measure at the end of the webinar and see how many new ones have gotten nailed down.
Right, there we go.
So let me follow up on that too. I think it's clear that at the federal and state level, the current situation, both the pandemic and what we're seeing now in California with the air quality and the wildfires, begs the question about how can we be better prepared for unknown events and multiple ones, and the exercise of what sorts of investments should be made now, given that all of those take a while, to be better prepared for such. Mm-hmm. And thinking how to meet that while at the same time meeting sustainability goals and addressing climate change is pretty challenging. Some of the solutions could actually increase the risk potentially faced under unknown situations and consequences. So the extent to which we'll need to invest more on storage technologies, microgrids, for example, vehicle electrification, as Rob was mentioning, become really apparent and really important to tackle. And so having almost energy systems thinking at the institutional level and by federal agencies and at the state level too should be something that should occur right now. Not wait for the next sort of events, and thinking critically what are the most cost-effective investments that can be pursued. I'd like to also follow up on something that Rob said about the vehicle electrification, which is indeed a needed move. I would note though that in our research we have found that really requires also simultaneously decarbonizing and cleaning up the power sector. Otherwise, in many locations globally, as you electrify, you may actually be increasing emissions of all kinds rather than decreasing emissions. So.
Yeah, there were two elements of what you just spoke about that are really, really interesting, and I'd like to follow up with everybody on. The first is that one of the things that's most striking about the challenges we faced in 2020 is that it's not just the pandemic, that we're looking at multiple things going wrong at once. There's the pandemic, there's the economic collapse, there's the appreciation of racial injustice, and certainly in California now we're seeing the implications of climate change playing out. And as we think about lessons learned, and Rob, you might want to start with comments on the natural world. So what are the unusual features that come from recognizing that we need to be prepared for multiple simultaneous interacting stresses?
That's a great question, Chris. I'd love to hear thoughts from the audience too. Well, I think we are in a world where I don't know if crisis is, well, we certainly are having crises, but where things are interacting, apparently at a much faster pace than they used to. The number of billion-dollar disasters that we face as a nation is substantially higher today than it was in an average year, a decade, and especially 2 decades ago, as we have 1 or 2 hurricanes bearing down on the Gulf Coast right now, as we have fires all over the Western United States. Some of these interacting factors are, random. Some of them are legacy effects of the way we manage land. Some of them are climate change related. Unquestionably now it's clear. So unfortunately, coronavirus is certainly sort of more random than some of these other effects, but climate, social factors, injustice, inequities. I mean, I think it's fair to say that we cannot fix the climate problem and pollution problem without addressing injustice and inequities in resource consumption. So I think these interacting factors are the way, it's just the way things are now. It's almost normal for us.
Margaret, one of the things that strikes me as we look at these complicated settings with multiple interacting factors is that there's a real priority on having sufficient expertise to really understand this complicated networks of interactions. But we also are at a historical era where there's a lot of distrust of expertise. And I wonder, in the social context, how you think about this mismatch between the kind of skills that are needed to understand the problems and the social milieu that's very distrustful of, traditional sources of expertise.
Well, that too is a very complicated problem, of course. I think the distrust of science is widely overstated. There is a significant minority of the population which is clearly deeply distrustful of almost all science. And there certainly is a problem that is created by the scientific method itself, which I think most people appreciate, that there's a lot of experiment and false starts. And that's true in any form of expertise. So I think the way you get around that is, even though the problems are incredibly complex, as Inez and Rob were speaking, it was clear that there were things that are under our control. So those are the things we really have to focus on right away, is what can we control, and what do we know about those things that we can control, and what do we know about the consequences of those in terms of distributional effects. So keeping equity in mind as we think about redoing our power grids so that they're both more energy efficient and resource saving of the earth, but also that they actually get to everybody who needs them. So I think that kind of expertise on that kind of area, though a complex problem, that's a doable, manageable problem ultimately. There's a lot of politics there, which I think is the bigger problem than the expertise or the science. As I said, vested interests in particular ways of doing things, old ways of doing things, is often a bigger barrier, I think, than the distrust of expertise.
Are there things that we in the expert community could be doing to make sure that the door is as open as possible to the political processes that can recognize the full range of competing interests?
Well, I think that requires a collaborative effort among those with considerable expertise and those with some political savvy. It can't just be, I mean, as we've seen with the COVID crisis, if you just let the scientists speak without some kind of collaboration with the political officialdom, it becomes very problematic because the scientists are looking at one set of concerns and not at the costs that are being imposed for various communities. Rob was making that very clear in what he was saying about energy and about our solutions, that we can't just come up with solutions that are advantageous to the middle class but hurt the poor. So I think that this is a collaborative process where there has to be expertise has to always be accountable, and it always has to be part of a discussion that's engaged with thinking about the distributional impacts and the trade-offs that are involved in any project we undertake.
Let me unravel a different aspect of this by swinging back to Nej's comment about how there are pathways to vehicle electrification that decrease emissions and there are pathways that increase emissions. One of the big challenges we face in a societal transition to sustainable clean energy sources is getting the timing right on all the different pieces. And especially with vehicle electrification, you could say, well, we won't decrease emissions until we have clean electricity to charge the electric vehicles, but then there's limited motivation for generating the clean electricity unless there's an electric vehicle to charge it up with. And how should we, Nej, be thinking about these issues that are related to the phasing and the implications of those for environmental exposure, environmental justice, and developing the economy?
So Chris, I think we can go about it two ways. The first one would be to really carefully quantify the effects and see over the life of the vehicles if deployed now and under the current grid, and foreseen decreases in the emission intensity of the electricity sector. Are we indeed decreasing the emissions, and if not, to not incentivize electric vehicles? But that's of course the wrong way to think about it, because we do need a lag time for adoption. And so I think it's perfectly fine even if there is a penalty on emissions increases in some areas in the country by using electric vehicles, because you're spurring the adoption and hopefully also bringing down the cost of electric vehicles as we do so. So even if there is a small increase, that would be something that I think would be agreed upon society, that the overall goals of adoption would have the largest benefits. Now, all of this is contingent on the emissions intensity from the grid declining. And so the key aspect would be to ensure that the pathways that we're pursuing on the electricity sector really increase the amount of renewables or nuclear, even natural gas, where that allows for emissions decreases when compared to coal, if that needs to be used as a transition fuel. So I would say all those steps would be important. But now this is where policy comes into play. The cost of electric vehicles is still larger than conventional gasoline vehicles for several of the vehicle models. And so having incentives, financial incentives for the adoption of those vehicles would be an important step. And it would be great to see those incentives actually tied to the environmental benefit that the vehicles may provide in different locations, for example. So that would be one way to think about it. I'll stop here. I suspect Margaret.
Let me
Yeah.
take this discussion to a different aspect of emissions. And here we are in our remote Zoom-based webinar. And there are certainly emission savings associated with not traveling, but there are also emissions associated with all of the IT infrastructure. I don't know whether Rob or Ines would want to comment on, as we look at decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, to what extent should we be thinking about pathways that focus on less travel versus pathways that focus on efficient travel, as we've just been discussing? And what are the things we should be thinking about in terms of the emissions that are associated with the electronic virtual life that so many of us have been cast into over the last several months?
You want to start, Ines?
I think you can go first.
Okay. Well, there's some great questions in the Q&A box around telecommuting and such. I guess a couple of quick thoughts about it. First of all, I think telecommuting is here to stay. The extent that that's 100% good or not, as it remains to be seen. I think it's probably, like most things in life, probably a mix. But I think it's fair to say that it will be normal for people to work at home at least a day or two a week, and that will reduce emissions, as long as people don't decide that they can live farther away because they only have to drive into work 3 days a week instead of 5. So lots of interesting social interactions around that. But I think overall, increased telecommuting, the notion, even as as a professor, the notion of flying across the country to give an hour's talk really seems kind of archaic in some ways now. We don't have the ability to meet students, to have lunch with students in a setting like this in quite the same way. But I think we'll do less of that, and that's reflected in the changes in emissions that have happened. If you look at road traffic, they're basically back to normal in the U.S. now in terms of miles driven. But I was just checking this morning on global air traffic, and it's still down 45%, for mid-August compared to the same week last year. So that's the number of flights that are taking off are still down a half. So so international travel and airline travel, may not come back to the same extent. We'll see. So that has the ability to change emissions. But of course, emissions from airline travel are much, much smaller than those from cars. And then just one other thought, kind of building on something that Ines said about electrification. We do have here in California SB 100, which mandates carbon neutral retail electricity by the year 2045. The bill is agnostic about pathway. So there are big differences that the outcome and costs have, depending on whether we were to go 100% sort of wind, solar, and renewables or storage, or allow some nuclear, or allow some carbon capture and storage with natural gas, things that are more sort of base load or dispatchable. So these are decisions that the state will have to make, and they have large consequences for cost, for land use, whether we need an extra 500,000 or even 1 million acres of solar panels if we forego some of those other more diverse forms of energy. So really, really important decisions that are being set in place right now, but big changes are happening.
Ines, did you want to comment on this one?
I think Rob said all the important things, but
Okay.
yeah, so I'll pass on this one.
Well, while we're on the topic
Can I ask
of
a question, Chris? Can I ask a question? Because it seems to me there's another source of carbon, of emission that we're not addressing, which has to do with the food supply chain. And, that's too has been under, the whole food supply chain has been a serious set of issues during this epidemic, but I don't get the feeling that there's been a lot of attention to either the way in which the land is used or the kinds of things we're eating as part of a learning process or a process of solving our environmental issues. I was wondering what the others in the panel sort of thought about that, because the food supply is a major source, as we know, of emissions.
Yes, indeed. And so some of our prior work actually has shown that agriculture has now surpassed other sectors in terms of the gross external damages from air pollution. So agriculture alone is higher than all utilities together, for example. So it definitely has a big impact. And the other interesting points that are raised by your question, Margaret, are that there are system linkages that we're not even considering right now. So if we move to online food, on food delivery rather than going to stores, there are implications also on the transportation sector and emissions, which could go both ways, could be a net emissions reduction or increase, really depending on frequency, where those are located, meaning if we do end up buying more stuff online and grocery shopping also with delivery, maybe there are less trips to the supermarket or not. Maybe you just do multiple requests of delivery for smaller amounts of stuff. So all of this really requires a sort of system analysis. And the good thing is that I think we're now in a situation in a world where data enables us to do so, to actually start quantifying some of those things with some robustness, using different types of scenarios and the data that is already acquired. And so we should definitely pursue that. This ties back also to the environmental justice issue, because I'm here talking about issues like food delivery and so on, that may not be a service available to large segments of the population. Similarly, on food choices and what we select to buy, and whether those are things that are produced in close proximity or not, and have large or small carbon content associated with their production. So I think that's a great question. Maybe Rob has much more insights also on how the food production is evolving.
Well, just briefly, thanks for your comments. It's really interesting, Inez. And great question, Margaret. I think we forget from the greenhouse gas standpoint that the nitrous oxide and methane emissions really are dominated by the agricultural sector, and I find them more intractable in some ways, more difficult to envision eliminating greenhouse gas from food production than I do from the energy sector, where, for methane leakage, there are new satellites and drones and aircraft technologies that can be used, and that'll help us find the big sources. But there's really there are ways that we can make progress by wasting less nitrogen fertilizer, for example. But in many cases, farmers are pretty efficient, and nitrous oxide emissions are primarily just a result of applying nitrogen fertilizers to the soil. And similarly for methane, we have cattle and ruminants produce almost as much methane as the oil and gas business does. So rice farming, where there's waterlogged soils and such. So I really I've been thinking a lot lately about how to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from the food production sector, and recognizing that there are a lot of co-benefits in doing so. If we can eliminate excess nitrogen fertilizer use, we don't just eliminate some greenhouse gas emissions, we clean up waterways. We have the potential to get rid of dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and many, many other places around the world where that nitrogen pollution and phosphorus flush downstream eutrophy the coastal areas and kill fish and other organisms that we get every year. So I think for a lot of these solutions, what I ponder most is trying to find this sweet spot of multiple goods. And there are many around the sort of water, air, and human health intersection.
But I also think about the incentives here to the farmers and to the agricultural sector, and how we're going to change those. I mean, being in the Pacific Northwest, we watched the forestry industry change a lot, but there was huge resistance to changing practices that were leading to deforestation and all the bad effects of that. Because people had a way of life and an investment in a particular way of doing things. So as you're noting, Rob and Inez, that the entrenchment of the agricultural sector is totally understandable. So we have to think about ways in which, you know, when I was talking about neutralizing opposition, I don't mean just getting rid of it in a mafia-like sense of neutralizing, but thinking hard about the incentives and ways of transforming what people are doing and giving them access to an equally good way of life if the one that they've been engaged in is going to be so transformed. And that's got to be part of this complex set of considerations.
Yeah, the question of incentives, I think, just permeates through every aspect of this. And at this point, we not only have interests that are entrenched that make dealing with the kinds of lessons from the pandemic challenging, but also that make it difficult to address the broader and in some cases even more difficult issues with social inequities and racial inequities. Let me ask one more question about the food system before we move to the audience questions. And the issues with food supply and food reliability have come under challenge in a couple of aspects. So one, there've been a lot of advocacy points for shortening supply chains. And there also has been a very potent recognition of the importance of low-wage, low-skilled labor in delivering many kinds of food products. And I wonder if there are consistent lessons from our experience with the pandemic about making a better, more robust food system in the context of those two issues. How long should the supply chains be, and how do we think about the labor involved in food production? I don't know who's best prepared to tackle that one.
Well, the problem is that there haven't been clear lessons from the pandemic on that. I mean, there's been some learning about who's actually involved in the food supply chain. And, you know, it's again, a complicated set of interests. So you have, some agriculture is extremely corporate. Some is very small farmers. And then we have the actual delivery system, which tends to, and both the packing and the gleaning of the food, which requires very low wage workers, often immigrant or people who are not given full rights either as labor or sometimes as citizens. So, you know, that all of those, figuring out the vested interest here and how to change that system, I think the necessity of doing it is being revealed by COVID, but we don't have any lessons we've gotten from that yet, except that there are groups of people with whom we should have a little more sympathy and think about ways in which we may ensure that they are healthy and safe as they get the food to us.
Okay, let me switch to questions from the audience, and I'll start with one from Catherine Martineau. She asks, how about unequal access to nature and natural environment during the lockdown? What can we say about the implications and the experience of that? Rob, is that sort of an ecosystem question?
I guess, I don't know exactly how to answer it, but one thought is whether that's really an issue of the lockdown or whether that's an issue of sort of social justice day to day and week to week and month to month. I mean, it's clear that, you know, urban spaces are not equally or don't have equal access to parks. Urban ecology is a burgeoning field looking at the benefits of trees, of open spaces, not just for things like air quality and water quality, but for peace of mind and mental health and things like that. So I'm not sure I see it as a COVID issue as much of just another manifestation of injustice for different wealth groups.
It's one
But I do think it is an issue, just as we were saying with the food supply, where COVID has revealed those inequities in a way that we could learn from and could do something about as a result, and has created a new kind of demand that is now based in much stronger evidence about the benefits of access to those kinds of resources.
Shined a spotlight on how important access to nature is and how unequal it is in our current setting. Yeah. Let me stick kind of with this theme. A question from Mary Whalen says, what do you think of the impacts of the surge of wealthy residents leaving cities during the pandemic? And what impacts will that have on urban planning? You think we're going to see permanent changes in the way cities work?
I can give anecdotal evidence from what my sister tells me from New York is after moving out, they're beginning to move back in. They miss the amenities of the city. So, I mean, again, it's just so early to tell what is going to happen. They're the sort of immediate reactions that people have if they have a second house and it's in a beautiful piece of country and it's summer, they head to it. But will they head back? And when the schools reopen, are the schools in those kinds of districts the ones they want to have? Are the healthcare systems the ones they want to have? So, I mean, I think we don't know yet what the effects are. We know the short-term effects, not the long-term effects.
But maybe just, if I could just jump in, Chris. I mean, it's a fascinating question, right? I mean, the whole pretext is that someone has the resources and a second home and the wealth to leave the dangerous place behind, right? The service workers don't. The agricultural workers, where rates of COVID are high in the Imperial Valley and the South Central Valley, where I just was, they're not leaving, they're working. So I think there's a lot to think about in that question beyond just how it might alter urban planning. There's a fundamental environmental justice component to that and social justice component to it that's just so glaring. And I think COVID has really, I hope, and also with some of the Black Lives Matter issues, really shone a light on that, and the extent to which we remember and go forward with that remains to be seen. But boy, the inequities are just glaring in COVID.
Yeah, for sure. This idea of people migrating from the city centers back to the suburbs also has implications for the energy system and energy use. And as you do want to comment on what we might see if there is in fact migration out of the city centers, in contrast to what Margaret's sister says is happening in New York.
So yeah, in that sense, we could see indeed a rebound effect in terms of an increase in the energy requirements from transportation that Rob highlighted earlier on. That change would really need to encompass also where do we work, where is leisure, and any change I think will be slow. I would love to state otherwise, but we have all this housing infrastructure and urban planning that cannot be changed overnight. So if a change were to happen in terms of the design of the cities, move to suburban areas and planning accordingly in a way that would be more environmentally just and in all its aspects, we won't see it in the next 5 years with some effects, right? I'll love Margaret and Rob to challenge this one, or you, Chris, but meaning it strikes me that we won't see anything major in terms of effects in that regard.
Let me turn now to a question for Rob. This one's from Ward Woods. No bias in selecting the questioner here. If natural gas has to be a bridge fuel to reduce carbon emissions, are the new gas infrastructures contributing to methane emissions? And if so, are there solutions to this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's just think briefly about what's happening in the US and Europe and what's happening in the rest of the world. So here in the United States, the increase in natural gas use is primarily going to offsetting coal use in the electricity sector. And I think there are good reasons to support that transition. Fewer carbon dioxide emissions, and even more dramatically, much less particulate pollution and other things. You know, pollutants, they kill people. I mean, the two biggest sources of mortality from air pollution in the US are cars and coal. So anything we can get rid of in terms of coal and go to something cleaner is a win. When we look at the rest of the world, though, most of the new natural gas infrastructure that's being built isn't replacing coal, it's answering new energy demand. And every time we build a new natural gas facility or something else that is is greenhouse gas dependent for 30 or 40 or 50 years, without the possibility of carbon capture and storage or other technologies that would allow us to rein in that pollution down the road, you know, we're locking in a set of emissions that will last for decades, obviously. So that's a big part of the equation for me. To what extent is it offsetting coal or offsetting the adoption of cleaner renewables? And the other part, I think, maybe in the backdrop to your question, Ward, is you know, what can we do to reduce methane emissions? And on that sense, there are really some great things happening. I mentioned satellites earlier. There are private satellite companies like GHGSat that can already be contracted to look at point sources. There are public satellites that are in the planning stages and should be launched in the next couple of years that will democratize finding large leaks. It will allow people to look anywhere in the world, from the US to Nigeria to Russia. Drones, as I've mentioned, aircraft technologies. So I'm actually quite optimistic that technology can help us find the largest leaks, and that'll help us in the natural gas sector, in the oil sector as well. But you know, there are also death by 1,000 cuts. We study leaks from household appliances, furnaces, water heaters, stoves, and things like that. So we have a lot of work to do if, in fact, natural gas use is to increase, and it can increase forever. It's got to go down or be coupled to carbon capture and storage. But there's still progress we can make in the next decade or two to reduce emissions substantially to buy us some time.
I've been having my own personal experience with legacy infrastructure issues this week when I've been trying to get PG&E to remove the gas meter now that we've got the house entirely off gas appliances. It's actually complicated and hard to do that. Let me go to a question that's more about the social fabric. This one's from Kathleen Riggs, and how to think about scaling collaborative decisions at the intersection of climate rights and health. And should we be looking at different scales, or are there different kinds of approaches we should be trying to pioneer for civic scale decision making? Margaret, that's more or less in your area.
It's a really interesting question, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. So Chris, maybe you could reframe it a little bit.
I mean,
or someone else could pick it up.
The issue is, do we need different structures for decision making? Should there be more happening at community scales or sort of regional scales? Are there spatial or temporal scales at which issues come into focus, such that our existing governmental entities really, you know, can't get their arms around them, where if we just approached it at a different scale, maybe, you know, more international for some things or more local for other things, we could do a better job?
Well, I think that's always been the case. I don't think there's anything new now about that, except, again, we're beginning, the racial justice movement has, for example, has made it really clear that, at least for some questions like policing, that community involvement should be much greater. I think in some of the questions that we've been talking about the food supply and whatever, there's also some scaling that could be done around that. Not just talking about local sources of food, but also what the distribution of food looks like in an urban area, for example. So we're seeing a big change in grocery stores. A lot can't make it in this situation, or are really transforming their practices. Well, that should become something that a city is deeply concerned about. That's not just a national policy. That has to do with a region and what it can provide and what the local sources are and whether there should be local markets or whatever. Other issues like, solving COVID is a big national, international problem where we really need international cooperation to think about vaccines, to think about treatments, where everybody's expertise at the scientific level is useful here. And other kinds of questions really require someone in the question. When I was looking at the Q&A, someone raised the question about maybe we should expand our notion of expertise, and I totally agree with that. For certain kinds of questions, often having to do with what should the city look like? How should its transportation system really evolve? What should its natural spaces be? And how do you encourage access to them? Really need the local experience and the lived experience and that level of expertise from the people who are experiencing that city and that particular urban area. So it's always been an issue. If you look at Elinor Ostrom's important work on governing the commons and her work on polyarchy, there's always different levels of decision making for different kinds of problems. And I think, again, what this crisis has done is revealed to us how important, how we have to rebalance that perhaps, and how we have to really recognize which areas need which kind of attention.
Really, it's shining a spotlight. Go ahead, Ina.
Yes, just so following up on that, it raises also very interesting questions about process of decision making, where we can learn a little bit from decision analysis too. So, and an opportunity for potential experimentation. So this could go through having city planning processes that in some cases are really deliberative, based on really the deliberative democracy sort of framework, and being highlighted about multiple aspects of their decision making, and emerging with a solution that everyone agrees upon, to actually looking at optimal solutions in the perspective of quantifying the costs of the solutions, the potential benefits, environmental benefits. And there was another question in the Q&A that really relates to this in an interesting way. The person was asking about whether there are actual tangible examples where costs, societal concerns, and the environment are evaluated equally in some framework. And this really raises the interesting question of how could we potentially include all of these things in a cost-benefit framework, and have the highlight from economists too on how to formulate that? Or would that be just an artificial construct, not ultimately reflecting well the preferences from the community? And just the question of how to incorporate environmental justice effects of proposed solutions in a quantifiable metric in benefit cost analysis is a big question by itself. So do you use some sort of index? Do you use probabilistic approaches for some of the outcomes? But it is really a wide range of decision analysis tool that could support the direction that, this question begs, Chris.
Can I reinforce something that Inez just said? I mean, I think the kinds of, in order to develop better processes and better solutions, the emphasis on both experimentation and what started this discussion, learning, is absolutely crucial. And that any solution we find for a particular moment in a particular place may not be the best solution as new things develop, as new information becomes available. So creating a process, it's not just a question of what level that process occurs or the scaling of it or the site of it, but also how we engage in that process so that we're constantly open to the changes and that we're experimenting, that we have an experimental mindset about how we're engaging in policy processes, and that we understand that expertise comes from multiple sources.
I love the direction this is taking and the emphasis on learning. We're getting close to the end now, and I want to ask one final question that's related to how expertise relates to these issues. This one comes from Robert Litterman, and it's about the issue of uncertainty and risk. Are there lessons about urgency in addressing risk management, and especially with the COVID-19 crisis, are there examples of places where we could have made better decisions if we had a better handle on accurately evaluating the risks?
Around COVID, Chris, or just sort of
Well, yeah,
issues in
our current situation, but around COVID as well. The question says, testing, social distancing, masks. But you can think about it with transportation or access to nature or electrification of the power grid.
So I'll take that one on, and that's a great question. So there's several pieces of the puzzle. One would be, can we abstract from the stressor, whether that's COVID or something else, and prepare our energy systems to accommodate anything in terms of a shock? And of course, that's costly. So all these trade-offs about doing so. So indeed, if we had already made the transition, for example, to more distributed energy resources, that would help a little bit with the independence and the usage patterns that we would see in a home, potentially. Again, it could go several ways. If we had invested in, as we think about the cases of fires in California, once again, a redesign of the way we produce and transmit electricity in the state could lead to a lower risk of blackouts, for example. So tying a little bit of how those stressors play out. So those would be the portions on the energy system, but there is another portion of risk, and definitely related to COVID and the way we perceive it. So we do have health workers being faced with a predominantly higher risk, obviously, but other parts of the production sector of the economy also being vastly exposed to a larger extent. So thinking about just people that are at the grocery store serving as cashiers and so on, they'll have a much higher exposure to risk, and predominantly given that those are enclosed spaces or in meat packing places, as we've seen, and so on. So, and that additional risk is not acknowledged by any means in their income levels. So you have this sort, or the potential risk that they face in terms of health costs if something happens. So that sort of planning that would involve risk, both risk of exposure and risk of future events happening, should definitely be included in the decision-making processes for the future of the energy systems in this country. Yeah.
Yeah, really, really thoughtful answer. We're about at the end now. Let me just say a couple of words of thanks and a couple of words of summary. So to Margaret and Rob and Ness, really fabulous conversation. Thank you so much. It seems to me that there are 5 concepts that have really come through consistently and in all of your thoughts. And I think these 5 provide a framework to hang a lot of progress on. The first is that the pandemic and the mixture of challenges we're seeing in 2020 really shine a spotlight on underlying weaknesses in infrastructure and society, and that we should take advantage of that spotlight to see where we can make progress. Many of the barriers to progress are related to institutions that aren't working in our favor, or to entrenched interests, and finding ways to moderate the role of entrenched interests in driving change is going to be critically important. We talked a lot about the role of expertise, and I think the sense I got from all of you is that expertise is really, really important, but it needs to be provided in a context that's both humble and open to learning, and that more than anything else, progress is going to be about learning rather than about delivering the insights from on high. A lot of our challenges that we face now have to do with a lack of trust in institutions, and having institutions that aren't worthy of our trust, and that finding ways to rebuild a civic dialogue and robust institutions is going to be really, really critical. And then finally, through everything we've talked about, there's been a huge emphasis and a huge recognition of the problem of injustice, whether that's related to race or economic status or geography, that until we're much more ambitious about tackling injustice, it's going to be really difficult to address any of the challenges that we're facing in that have been revealed by the pandemic. So thanks to everybody for a wonderful conversation. We can continue in these talk back sessions, for which everybody should have the Zoom links. I want to take just a couple of minutes to thank Molly Field and the Woods Events team for putting on a spectacular event. I want to thank Justin Warren and his team at Cypress Communications for making the webinar aspects go really smoothly. And I want to thank all of you for joining us in a conversation on the most important topic of our era. So thanks so much. I look forward to seeing you in the talkback session in just a few minutes.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everyone.